most obvious answer is we're engaged in massive self-deception about the threat. Maybe that's too easy to say, but look, how many people within the American establishment simply believe war will never come between the United States and China? That's true of, I mean, even though this Pentagon understands the threat and is doing something about it, how many people within the U.S. government, within the U.S. Congress, within, Wall Street and the corridors on K Street, the offices on K Street there in Washington, D.C., they believe war will never come between the United States and China. We're all making too much money, they think. And because we're all making money, they think that, people like Frank Gaffney and the Committee on the Present Danger of China, they're just tilting against windmills. That's all just talk. And even though China builds advanced nuclear weapons and they build missile defenses and they build very advanced space capabilities and fighter aircraft and what have you, that war will never come. And you have a guy like Donald Trump, and he's talking tough, but at the end of the day, this too will pass, and that our economies are just so intertwined, the U.S. economy and the Chinese economy, that at the end of the day, we'll realize that war is such a distant possibility that we should just all get along. We should all make money. We should further intertwine our economy with theirs. If Chinese corporations want to operate in the United States and make money, good for them, good for us. We're making money, all is well.
Even military companies.
Even military companies, because they think, well, if what does it matter if war never comes?
Let me ask you, Brian, because it's been a hardy perennial of these various conversations to point out, as I said at the very beginning, war has come. We are in a war. It is an unrestricted warfare, to be sure, and has been going back, I think, to the 1990s. But it's also more contemporaneously been described by the Chinese, I think it was in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, that a people's war has been declared against us by the CCP. We don't have to speculate whether that is so. That is what the People's Daily, the main propaganda arm of the Chinese Communist Party, had in its pages, as I recall, in May of 2019. Is this really cognitive dissonance? That we're making so much money and therefore we don't want to see the threat and therefore we don't see the threat? Or is something else operating, Brian? Have we gotten to a point, do you think, perhaps, where there's actually a loyalty to the other party, in this case, the enemy, that is now prompting people to behave as they are, not just, greed?
Practically speaking, yes, it is loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party, practically speaking. Of course, what they would think is they're not so much loyal to the Chinese Communist Party as to a globalist system that seems to be working for the United States. We're the wealthiest country on earth, and yet we're the ones who've been advancing this style of economic behavior for about a half a century, right? And so they think this must be working. And so if it's working, let's just keep it going. And so they're loyal they're loyal practically to the Chinese Communist Party, but really loyal to this idea of globalism. And Trump's an anti-globalist, just to be clear. But this globalism is still part of the U.S. government and the Trump administration, unfortunately. Their failure to actually press hard enough on all of these Chinese corporations that are doing business here, the Chinese nationals that are here in the United States. I mean, the litany of things that we've described on these webinars, from 200,000 Chinese nationals that came during Biden that look to be men of military age, to Chinese corporations that are operating here, military corporations, but regular Chinese corporations or Chinese cutouts that are buying up U.S. farmland especially around U.S. military installations, Chinese espionage that goes on here. There's still estimated $600 billion a year being stolen in American intellectual property by communist China. Your point about the war continuing, that's absolutely right. And so it's massive self-deception on the part of the Americans that this continues. And the Chinese look at this, by the way, with a kind of contempt. They think to themselves, how stupid are these Americans that they would let this happen, that they would let the Chinese Communist Party steal their intellectual property with impunity, that they would buy up our land with impunity. This is frankly a scandal, and working our way out of this is not an easy task. It's very difficult. I mean, they have certain advantages with their rare earth minerals and certain parts of their economy that are still necessary for the U.S. economy. And so building our way out of this is going to take a while.
Let me just ask you another question, Brian, on this point of, course corrections. And,
right.
There's no getting around it, that there's enough inertia as well as, perceived self-interest to cause people to say, well, we're not going to do this. We're certainly not going to do this anytime soon. But one of the things that has popped up that, again, prompted this webinar is in retaliation for the additions to the 1260H lists by the Pentagon, the Chinese Finance Ministry, I think on the 22nd of June, announced retaliatory measures. And they said that government agencies of People's Republic of China would no longer be allowed to acquire the products of, I believe it was 46 specified U.S. companies. And what popped out for many of us looking at that list was those companies included Lockheed Martin, Boeing Defense, General Dynamics, and Raytheon, four of the largest and most important U.S. defense contractors. And again, the question occurs, Brian, what is it that U.S. defense contractors are selling to the Chinese, and to what end? And what other interactions are taking place that might actually create vulnerabilities that are exploited by the Chinese to the detriment of our military and national security, sir?
Well, Frank, as you well know, during the Cold War, we didn't have this view. We didn't believe in selling sensitive materials to the Soviet Union because we were in a Cold War with them and they presented an existential threat. We don't have that way of thinking with Communist China. And so we don't have within our government the apparatus in place to make sure that such transfers of technology, sales of sensitive equipment, is forbidden with Communist China. Again, this is massive self-deception on our side. That's the only thing to account for it. There's no reasonable way of thinking about this, unfortunately. It's not like we can make the argument that selling, sensitive military technology to Communist China from a Raytheon or a Lockheed or a Boeing, we can't make the argument that that's somehow good for the United States. No. We're doing it because we're engaged in self-deception. We don't believe we're in a war with them, even though they believe we're in a war with us. And even though President Trump believes this, and I keep coming back to President Trump because so many on our side will say, well, look, President Trump understands the threat. Why isn't this being stopped? He's one man, and he's doing everything he can to get certain things put in place. But he doesn't have an administration that is capable of taking that understanding and turning that into operational policy throughout the government to make sure those sales aren't going on. And until we get that understanding held government-wide throughout the U.S. Congress and throughout all of Wall Street and Washington, until that understanding is fixed in their heads that they present an existential threat to the United States, until we do that, we are going to be enabling the Chinese Communist Party and their military to become, over time, the preeminent power on earth. And we do that, obviously, in a suicidal way. That's the only rational way we can think about it.
I want to come back to the policy issue and the president's. And that is that we have on the books still a memorandum of understanding. I talked about it a little bit with Sam Faddis, whereby then Vice President Joe Biden helped engineer essentially unlimited access for Chinese companies, including Chinese military companies, to our capital markets. So it's not just that we've been selling stuff, including perhaps in significant ways. You've, I think, said $600 billion worth of intellectual property is either migrating legally, being sold above board, or being stolen. But these folks on Wall Street have been underwriting, providing the rope, as we say, in terms of at least financing its purchase, as well as what is being done in the technology space and in the military. What are we to make of the fact that this memorandum of understanding remains on the books, even after all this time, and even after President Trump in February of last year promulgated something that he called the America First investing policy as a means of correcting this practice, ending the kind of sweetheart arrangements that the Chinese uniquely enjoyed, and the financing to the tune, by some estimates, of maybe $5 or even $6 trillion by American public pension funds, mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, individual investors and their life savings, and so on. A good bit of which has helped underwrite, among other things, the People's Liberation Army's military buildup. So the question on policy, this has not been implemented in any way, as far as I can tell, the American First investment policy. Why not, in your estimation, sir? And should it now be fully?
It should be fully implemented, absolutely. Look, I think you've answered the question, though, in a way. If it's $5 or $6 trillion that U.S. investors have put into Chinese companies, and we implement that policy, that means we have to unwind $5 or $6 trillion of investments from communist China back to presumably other investments. And that process of unwinding, let's say at the high end, $6 trillion of investments, means that the stock market, in theory, because I think most of these Chinese stocks are either fraudulent, overvalued, and what have you, if we unwound them, that $6 trillion may only turn out with liquidation to maybe $1 trillion or less. That means the U.S. stock market is going to take, just logically speaking, a $5 trillion hit. And any president or secretary of the Treasury or Treasury Department or Commerce Department is not going to want to see a $5 trillion hit to the U.S. stock market. And people like you and me don't want to see that $5 trillion hit either necessarily, but we know that the current system can't continue, where we have U.S. investors, moms and dads around the country who are putting their money faithfully in retirement accounts, going to communist China through mutual funds. That's what's going on today. And either we decide to take the hit and quit funding the Chinese Communist Party and all of its corporations, or we continue down this path where we are going to simply finance our own destruction. That's where we are. And it's going to be a painful process, to be sure, this unwinding from communist China, but it's absolutely necessary. And I think President Trump believes in it, but doing it in an orderly way so as to cause minimal disruption and economic hardship to the American investor is, I think, what he's shooting for here. And again, not so easy to do that unwinding, but it has to be done. And I think it will be done. I pray it will be done over time.
Set on our destruction, beavering away to bring it about through a whole variety of means, unrestricted warfare means, and is doing so with considerable effect. I think it has to be said over the years, certainly, the damage done. Just the fact that we are so coupled and so dependent and so bereft of industrial capabilities or manufacturing of some of these critical things like chips and pharmaceuticals and batteries and stuff, in no small measure thanks to this unrestricted warfare. But my question to you is this, Brian. Is there really, at the end of the day, any substitute for ending the Chinese Communist Party and the misrule that it has inflicted upon its own people, for these decades, since 1949? Or is there some basis upon which we can decouple? Yes, but having made the investments, having provided the technology, having enabled the military buildup, that this enemy will remain and almost certainly will be continuing aggressively to pursue their ambition, which is to take out us, our country, our form of government, our counterweight to their ambitions and capabilities. I guess I just would ask you to sort of say, what is the point of decoupling? Is it in the end to bring about, as my old boss Ronald Reagan achieved with the last communist, totalitarian threat that sought our destruction, the Soviet Union, to put the CCP, as he would put it, on the ash heap of history?
Great question, Frank. I don't know, frankly, whether we're going to be able to bring down the Chinese Communist Party through any of our sort of active measures there in communist China. It seems to me the way you bring down the Chinese Communist Party is having a strong United States, and we're not strong enough today. It seems to me the focus of our efforts should be more on how do we fix the United States? If you fix the United States, if you get right the policies that have weakened us, meaning the exporting of jobs abroad, if you bring those jobs back home, if you invest in the American military, if you invest internally in the United States, if you get people to be invested again, as it were, in the success of the United States, meaning the American people, if you get them invested in what makes this country great, meaning everybody has a job, who wants a job, who needs a job. If you start rebuilding our industrial base, if you start increasing home ownership, if you do those things, improving education, sort of the litany of things that would be part of domestic internal improvement. If you do that, and we're strong, and we understand as a people that we have enemies abroad, and we become the focus of human excellence here in the United States, it won't matter what communist China does. They're going to do what they do. They're going to repress their own people. They're going to seek to dominate Asia. They're going to seek, as always, to destroy the United States. We're not going to be able to slow them down, per se, without fixing things here in our country. without changing the mindset of the people within the United States, we're not going to slow them down. We have to quit investing in communist China and sending our retirement dollars and putting them in their corporations. Let's start there. Let's start with building things here in the United States again, employing Americans. We do all of those things. Ultimately, it seems to me that will force communist China to change or to weaken, or at minimum, to persuade them that it will be foolish to try to destroy the United States. But so long as there is only a, unfortunately, small number of us who understand the threat from communist China is winning. Today, let me say, communist China is winning. And that has to stop.
I don't disagree. And I would just like to mention in that regard, a shameless plug, the book that came out of, I think, the first 70 or so of these webinars, co-authored by me and our colleague Didi Logison, entitled The Indictment, Prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and Friends for Crimes Against America, China, and the World. And the point of the book, Brian, as you know, is that we have this cohort of people who are, been describing it throughout this program, enabling the enemy at a minimum, if it is not actually made illegal to do that, which I believe it should be the state of affairs. But the people who are profiting and being enriched by all of this have lobbyists. And they spend enormous amounts of money ensuring that it remains legal to aid and abet our mortal enemy. If they're not going to be guilty of actual illegal activity as a result of those efforts, at the minimum, in what I call the court of public opinion, they need to be prosecuted for betraying our country and imperiling all of us, including, by the way, them and their families and their loved ones. It's almost unimaginable that people would be indifferent to those considerations. But there does seem to be, Brian, as you know, as a student of history, this conceit on the part of people who betray their countries that they will profit from doing so, not just in the present moment and in a pecuniary sense, but if the other side actually wins, they will be in an advantaged position. Generally speaking, I think history shows that what actually happens to them is they are the first taken up against the wall and shot by that new regime. So they should be mindful of that. But if none of that matters, at the minimum, I think the fact that they are regarded by their countrymen and women as people betraying all of us is something that has to be part of the predicate here, the course corrections that you've described, Brian, and our other colleagues. So it has to start there, it seems to me, or you're not going to get very far because you're working against an enemy within. Let me simply say thank you, Brian.